my lovelies, welcome back to my channel. Happy belated Disability Pride Month. I know, you're probably asking, why am I waiting till the third week of August to talk about Disability Pride? My life is busy. If you're new to my channel, my name is Isa, and I am a disabled advocate and writer. I recently graduated with my master's in communication studies with a focus in disability culture and identity. And I'm a Disney College program participant, hence the irregular chaos. So I want to talk about Disability Pride because there have been a lot of conversations around Disability Pride Month this year in organizations. However, I haven't seen some key conversations that happen. My last week's video talked about where Disability Pride Month comes from, the history of it. This week, I want to talk about what is Disability Pride, because when we say Disability Pride, there's generally a little bit give and take, especially with newly disabled individuals and other people with disabilities, if you don't know the history and the concept behind Disability Pride. So that's what this video is going to talk about. We'll address what is Disability Pride and why is it important. I really hope that you enjoy this video. If you have any questions along the way, please leave a comment down below. So let's answer the big question. What does Disability Pride actually mean? According to the Disability Community Resource Center, they define Disability Pride as an accepting and honoring each person's uniqueness and seeing it as a natural and beautiful part of human diversity. I really like this definition of Disability Pride. However, I want to add a few amendments to it. I want you to think about Disability Pride in contrast to shame, or being ashamed of your disability, because I think this is where a lot of the disconnect people have for their disabled identities and their disability pride is that there's a perspective of like, why should I be proud of my body that is broken? Why should I be proud of my hard experiences, of my pain? But my better question for you is, why should we be ashamed of these aspects? Disability pride comes from a perspective of these things are generally shamed, that they're stigmatized. However, disability pride is by taking a perspective and saying, these things shouldn't be stigmatized. These aspects are things that I am not going to be ashamed of. In fact, I'm going to be proud of them. I'm going to be proud of my membership in the community. I'm going to be proud of what my body exists and how it is today. It's about accepting and even seeing it in a neutral manner. Disability pride is about being proud of all these facets of our lives and being proud of what our disabled bodies are doing, what our disabled minds are doing, how we function and see the world, because it is important, because it is valuable, and because it is beautiful, even if not every circumstance and every experience is beautiful in itself. But I can already hear you saying, Isa, I really don't feel proud of my body. I don't feel proud because I'm in pain. I don't feel proud because I have a life-threatening condition. I don't feel proud because of X, Y, and Z. And I think the best way to explain this, if you are a Marvel fan, if you're not, please hold on with me, is through the example of the X-Men. I remember seeing, I think it's the third movie, which is overall probably very bad. Not probably, it is kind of very bad. But there's a scene in that X-Men movie where Rogue, who has a power that literally kills people if she touches them, and Storm, who can make really cool storms and is super powerful, and both of them are very powerful in their own unique way. But Rogue talks about her desire for a cure, and Storm says, no, you should be proud of your mutant powers, you should be proud of who you are, because we are mutants, because we are who we are. And I think this is kind of very representational of some of the difficulties that people have with disability pride and identifying as disabled in the first place, is because we have these conversations that don't always recognize the different experiences of people with disabilities. People who are autistic and deaf have a very specific experience where there is really nothing wrong with them, that the world is inaccessible, and that they are not broken. And I think there's a weird relationship with the word broken, but that concept is fully enmeshed in the autistic and deaf communities, is that that is who they are and that there is absolutely nothing wrong with them. Now, this gets more complicated when you go into corners of people who have chronic pain, people who have life-threatening conditions, people in my community who, I have mitochondrial disease. It is a life-threatening condition. I grew up watching people that I knew die from my disability. And so with that, it does complicate your relationship with disability pride, because how am I supposed to be proud of something that I do want to cure for? I do want to prevent death. And I think this is a difficult relationship that we need to talk about more in that nuance, because, and going back to shame, I think going back to the ways that we are told to be ashamed of our bodies is the best way to identify disability pride and identify the ways that we can have a relationship with disability pride. So when we're talking about having chronic pain, when we're talking about cures, when we're talking about all of these things, we need to create space for others who have different experiences and relationships with disability pride, but also look at the ways in which how much of it is our frustration at our bodies for not doing the things that we want it to, and then also the expectation that we have placed on us and then we place on ourselves to achieve things that really shouldn't be the standard in the first place. And I think this is better identified with my personal experiences being a wheelchair user, is that using a wheelchair, when I became a wheelchair user, more, not full time, but at least 3/4 of the time, I got really frustrated with my body because it was a symbolic of the progression of my disability. However, I've had to work on my relationship to my wheelchair because it's given me the freedom that I hadn't had for years before I got my wheelchair. And it is a mode of freedom. And so I am proud of my disabled body. I am proud of my being a wheelchair user. I am proud of my relationship with those things. And when we talk about concepts of a cure, we also need to recognize the ways that cures actually work. A lot of times we talk about a cure and people are like, oh, that means that you're fully healthy. However, that's not how cures typically work. That when you have a life-threatening condition, each time that you have a progression or a progressive disability, each time you have a progression, that doesn't always mean that you can bounce back, even if you have a cure. So when you look at the concept of a cure, it's more so preventing progression, preventing hopefully death. And that is where we need to understand those that line in the different relationships that people have with their disabilities. And I think we'll explain this nuance a little bit better when we answer the question, why is it important? But before we go there, I want to address an essay that I mentioned in my previous video about Crip Ancestors, written by Stacey Milbourne, published in Disability Visibility, edited by Alice Wong. Not complicated. Round, which Disability Visibility is a collection of essays by disabled individuals. And what this essay by Stacey Milbourne talks about is the concept of Crip ancestry, which is recognizing the people who came before us. And it doesn't always mean recognizing the people who were huge advocates, the people who went out of their way, who did these things, who were part of the Capitol Crawl, who were part of the ADA and advocating for that, who were part of the 504 sit-in. While those things are very, very important to recognize and hold space for and be very proud of, it also means recognizing every single disabled person that came before us, every single person who was in a freak show, every person who was put in an asylum, every person who never made it out of the hospital, because those individuals are part of our community, they're part of our ancestry, their experiences live in us, and we hopefully are fighting to live in a world that they dreamt about and fighting for access, that our disabilities can exist and coexist with the world. And I think that's also part of disability pride, is that recognizing the ways that we allow ourselves to have space to exist, to be proud of our existence, to not have to prove our worth to exist. And this comes down to, why is disability pride important in the first place? Why is it important to recognize that we should give ourselves spaces to exist, that we should be proud of who we are and proud of our relationship with our bodies, proud of the work that we've put in, proud of our experiences as disabled identities, in addition to recognizing the ways that we have internalized ableism, and how we have experienced shame of our disabilities. Because this comes down to a lot of what we saw during the pandemic. If you're new to my channel, I completed my master's thesis exploring the experiences of high-risk disabled individuals during the pandemic, their disability identity management, and the moral messages they received during the pandemic. And if those are concepts that you don't want to particularly hear right now, go ahead and skip ahead a few minutes. But I want to address some of the things that people with disabilities, especially high-risk individuals, heard and experienced during the pandemic, and kind of show you some of the quotes, because these things did affect people with disabilities. It did prevent people with disabilities from getting care during the pandemic, and it has continued to prevent people with disabilities to get care, and prevented them from getting access to the things that they have needed before the pandemic and the things that they've especially needed during the pandemic. The first thing that comes to mind when I think of the horrible commentary, the dehumanizing, the demoralizing messages that happened during the pandemic, the things that are just stained with ableism and horrific to hear, is one story of this individual who was trying to have a connection with someone, trying to get them to care a little bit, and ask them, hey, do you have anyone that you care about that is high risk? And the person said, well, my grandma's lived a good life, so if she has to die for the sake of our economy, she has to go. And it's these types of messages that another participant explained that people were saying things like only disabled people were going to die, and that felt like, oh, only you're going to die, and that's a sacrifice I'm willing to make. That people with disabilities' lives weren't worth the effort to put on a mask, that aren't worth the effort to take precautions to make sure that we're not spreading the virus further, that we're protecting people who are high risk, protecting individuals who need that protection, because it makes you uncomfortable. And when it comes to disability pride, I think what's important is, yes, there is a relationship between non-disabled individuals and disabled individuals, and as a disabled individual saying, my life matters and I'm not going to let you dehumanize it anymore. If you want to be a part of my life, you're going to have to do things to honor the importance of my life and my existence. And that is what people in my thesis did, but also recognizing the ways in which society has rejected people with disabilities and put shame on us overall, in order to give ourselves space to advocate for us the way that we've always needed, to use the mobility aids that we've always needed. Because if we're going to be rejected, no matter what we do, no matter how kind or appeasing we try to be, that if our lives are so generally disregarded and seen as things that we should be ashamed of or not worth living, then why shouldn't we use our mobility aids? Why shouldn't we seek out the care that we need? Why shouldn't we advocate and create space for us to simply exist and enjoy life in the way that we've wanted to enjoy life? Even if that means that we no longer can coexist in the same way with non-disabled individuals. And that was the most profound aspect of looking at my thesis, of individuals who found disability pride from the depths of the pandemic, not because the pandemic made them proud of being disabled, but rather, like going back to what I was saying at the beginning of this video, is that disability pride, in my opinion, in its truest form, is recognizing the ways that we have internalized ableism, recognizing the ways that society tells us that we are to be ashamed of our bodies, of our experiences, that we should be ashamed of what our bodies and what we can and can't do, that we should be pitied because of those things, and basically saying my life matters more than that, and that I owe it to myself to face that shame, to recognize it within myself and give myself some space to breathe and some space to exist and love my existence for every gritty part of it. And that's what disability pride means. That's what it means to have disability pride, especially when we recognize our communities. Because when we recognize disability pride, when we recognize being proud of us and who we are as individuals, and we turn and say, I'm part of a bigger community, I'm part of a community that has done all of this work to give us access, I am part of a community that is resilient and has survived, that we are telling other disabled individuals, you are part of a community that is resilient and has survived. You are resilient. You do not need to prove your worth to exist. And I think these things are things that we're going to desperately need as we continue to try to recover from the pandemic, as we continue to live in the middle of a pandemic that no one seems to recognize. And it's especially important for young disabled individuals. I have, as I talked about in my last video, particular passion for young disabled individuals, people who grew up disabled, especially during this pandemic, because I know I struggled so much with these dehumanizing and demoralizing messages that I experienced as an adult during the pandemic, that I can't imagine having these blatant messages be such a key part of my teenage years, of my childhood, that it's so important for those of us who are older, who are more vocal about our disabled experiences, who share that part of us, that we are very clear about what disability pride means to us, that we are very clear about what it means to be part of the community, even if you don't want to share every gritty aspects of your disability. I typically don't. I don't necessarily talk about every symptom I have, of the way that it affects me every single day beyond, being a wheelchair user, just because that's an easy conversation for me to have, easier than other aspects. And yet I think it's important, things that I would have wanted growing up as a young disabled person who is facing a progressive illness. So when we think about disability pride, I really want to encourage you to be proud of your disability, to look into the difference between person first language and identity first language, because there was a key moment, a shift for myself when I saw disability as something as part of who I am, and it's part of my experience, it's part of the way I view the world, that I started identifying as a disabled individual, because that allowing myself to exist as a disabled individual, allowing myself and giving myself space to pursue my dreams, giving myself space to just simply exist beyond the expectations that's placed on us, that means the world. And it means something to fight that shame. So what's your experience with disability pride? Do you feel proud of being a disabled individual? How has your relationship changed over the years? I want to hear all about it. And if you want to talk more about disability pride, I have endless commentary, so please comment down below. I love you guys. You matter, your lives matter, and I'm so proud and glad that you exist today.